All right, good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the San Francisco Board of Supervisors Land Use and Transportation Committee meeting for Monday, May 22nd, 2017. My name is Mark Farrell. I'll be chairing this committee. I am joined by our committee vice chair, Supervisor Aaron Peskin, as well as Supervisor Katie Tang. I want to thank Jim Smith and Ben English from SFGTV for covering this meeting, as well as Erica Major and John Carroll, our clerks. Mr. Clerk, do we have any announcements?
Yes, please, thank you. Please make sure to silence all cell phones and electronic devices. Completed speaker cards and copies of any documents to be included as part of the file should be submitted to the clerk. Items acted upon today will appear on the June 6th Board of Supervisors agenda unless otherwise stated.
Okay, thank you very much. Mr. Clerk, would you call item number 1?
Agenda item number 1 is an ordinance amending the administrative code to include all persons, regardless of age, who have been lawfully occupying a rental unit as eligible tenants for purpose of calculating Ellis Act relocation payments.
Okay, thank you very much. This item was sponsored by Supervisor Ronan. We have her staff here to speak on this item.
Hi, thank you very much. Good afternoon, supervisors. My name is Carolyn Goosen, and I'm here representing Supervisor Ronan, who unfortunately could not be here today. Last month, the First Appellate District Court of Appeal for the state of California ruled that children living in rented apartments with their family are not owed relocation payment if the family is evicted under the Ellis Act because they are deemed occupants but not tenants. This decision, frankly, hurts families with children who are already struggling to stay in the city, and it's just another example of how unfriendly San Francisco can be to tenant families with children. As you know, most evicted families have to leave the city once they have been evicted, but additional relocation assistance would give some families a fighting chance to stay in San Francisco. This legislation provides a simple fix to this very troubling problem by affirming that children are indeed eligible tenants, specifically in the context of Ellis Act relocation assistance. We would like to thank Supervisors Yee, Breed, Sheehy, Fewer, Peskin, and Safai for their co-sponsorship, and would also like to thank Steve Collier, an attorney with the Tenderloin Housing Clinic, for working closely with us on this legislation. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Colleagues, any questions or comments? Supervisor Tang.
Just one question from our office that came up when we were discussing this legislation is whether someone who is pregnant would that qualify as a child, or is it someone who's actually already been born? And
yeah, the way the legislation is written, it's occupants regardless of age. So in that case, it would not count. It is all of the occupants in the unit.
So again, after their birth and out. Okay, thank you.
Okay, colleagues, any further questions? We will move on to public comment. Anybody wish to comment on item number 1?
Good afternoon, members of the board. My name is Steve Collier. I work closely with Supervisor Ronan's office in proposing and drafting this legislation. It's very important. I represented the tenants at 306 Bartlett Street in Supervisor Ronan's district, where we had won at the trial court level and in one appellate level that a child was a tenant under the rent ordinance for purposes of relocation assistance. But the First District Court of Appeal, on a certification of the appeal, ruled otherwise, and that's why we need this essential fix to the ordinance to correct essentially just a legislative intention issue as to whether the ordinance applies, the relocation provisions of the Ellis Act apply to minor children. The First Appellate District specifically said that they were not saying that it doesn't, or that the Board of Supervisors can't enact this law. It simply said that the way it was enacted, it doesn't apply to minors. So the Board of Supervisors clearly has the authority to change the law in this regard, and we thank you for and Supervisor Ronan's office for introducing this amendment. And we ask that it be enacted quickly, simply because there are other tenants facing Ellis Act evictions in the future who may not get relocation payments for their children if this isn't enacted quickly. So if there are no questions, thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Anybody else wish to speak in public comment on item number 1? Seeing none, public comment is closed. Okay, colleagues, we have item number 1 in front of us. Any questions or comments? Do I have a motion?
I'll make a motion to send this forth to the full board with positive recommendation.
Okay, motion by Supervisor Tang. We can take that without objection. Mr. Clerk, would you call item number 2, please?
Agenda item number 2 is an ordinance amending the police and building codes to require employers to have a policy regarding lactation in the workplace and provide lactation spaces, require new and renovated building projects to include lactation rooms, and making appropriate findings.
Okay, thank you very much. This item was sponsored by Supervisor Tang, so I will turn it over to her.
Thank you so much, colleagues. So today we have part 2 of ordinance that our office has been working on in the past year regarding lactation policies and places for women to be able to pump when they come back to work. We know it's a very difficult conversation for many women to be able to have with their employers. And so this part of the legislation makes certain requirements of the private sector in different businesses to be able to provide lactation accommodation spaces when there are tenant improvements in the buildings. And so I do want to thank my staff, Ashley Summers, for her incredible work on this legislation with our City Attorney, Brad Russey, and of course, our partners at Department of Public Health, Pat Mulligan from OLSE, Julia Parrish from Legal Aid at Work, Dee Dee Workman from the Chamber, all the BOMA members who provided their feedback, and of course DBI as well. So in a nutshell, again, we are requiring that our city, in terms of the private workforce, must have lactation accommodation policies. So one of the things is that when there is a new hire for an employer, that new hire, as well as when they are requesting parental leave, the employer must provide them with a written policy around lactation accommodations and what would be provided to them should they need it. They must retain the documents or electronic versions to make sure that they have provided that information to the employees. The other part is regarding an amendment to the building code to require that when there are tenant improvements made, that there be lactation rooms or stations. There are a couple things that we do specify, such as some of the size, the location, the minimum square footage which would be triggered, and so forth. And of course, designating OLSE to be able to enforce the lactation accommodation requirements. And so, again, as I mentioned earlier, I think this is really important for us to write into law, because even though it is already state and federal law that are existent around lactation accommodations, we find that many employees and employers are not aware of this, or it's not specific enough, and so many of these things aren't happening. We also do understand that with small businesses that sometimes there may be challenges, and so of course there's language built into here to ensure that this does not hurt smaller businesses. So for today's purpose, I do have some amendments to make in Land Use Committee. So I've circulated some of these amendments to my colleagues, and you'll see outlined that there are many pages worth. So for example, we clarify that you can have lactation stations within rooms. So there's just some clarity around that. We clarify that employee break times may be unpaid, but it does not have to be unpaid if it lasts longer than the break time already provided by the employee. Thirdly, we talk about multi-use rooms and clarify that rooms used for lactation may also be used for other purposes as long as lactation accommodation takes priority. As I mentioned, we do have clauses in here regarding undue hardship. We also have language in here regarding anti-retaliation. So retaliation against an employee for requesting lactation accommodation is prohibited. In terms of leave requests, we just wanted to ensure that the word pregnancy was inserted to ensure that employers provide a copy of lactation accommodation to anyone who asks for parental or pregnancy leave. Records, we allow for written as well as electronic record storage. Complaints, we urge OLSE to resolve complaints as quickly as possible given the time-sensitive nature of the issue. We move certain portions of the lactation policy from the police code to the building code where it is more appropriate. And we clarify that the responsibility of building the lactation room will be with the project sponsor of tenant improvements. So this is to ensure that rooms are only built when the end user, the employer, knows how many employees will be in specified areas. We added group R1 to the requirement, so that includes now hotels and motels. We increased the minimum square footage threshold for when a project sponsor would need to create a lactation room, going from 10,000 square feet to 15,000 square feet. And we changed the cost threshold from $500,000 to $1 million. We specify a couple other things regarding the lactation room, which is that one electrical outlet is required for every lactation station, an additional one for refrigerator. Sink must have hot and cold running water, and a room must be located within 2 adjacent floors of the farthest employee workspace. Sinks would only be required if the tenant improvement project already has plumbing work involved. Signage, we just refer to building code for specifications. We lowered the number of lactation rooms and stations required per building. This was after significant feedback from BOMA members. The operative date now is changed to January 1st, 2018. In terms of enforcement, OLSC must first issue a notice to correct before issuing an actual notice of violation. And then the last things, we do ask CPH for, in their best practices, to include examples of permissible lactation locations to assist employers. So I apologize, there were a lot of amendments here, but this was after, again, significant conversations with BOMA members, chamber members, small business community, Department of Public Health, and so forth, to make sure that this was going to be a feasible legislation. But I'm really excited that this lactation policy, and again, thanks to my aide, Ashley Summers, I think will be one of the strongest in this nation. So with that, colleagues, I'm happy to answer any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang. Seeing no questions at this time, we'll open up to public comment. Are there any members of the public that wish to comment on item number 2? We have comment cards? Okay. 1 second. Okay, I'll read these off. We have Blake Peterson, Julia Parrish, Shelley Rawlings-Fine, Dee Dee Workman, Christian Pradia. And anybody else, please line up. Everyone will have 2 minutes to speak.
My name is Blake Peterson. I am here on behalf of the Board of Directors for the Building Owners and Managers Association of San Francisco, known as BOMA. BOMA oversees 42 million square feet of mainly high-rise commercial office buildings. I'm also the Director of Asset Services for Cushman & Wakefield, so I oversee 32 buildings here in downtown San Francisco, about 7.2 million square feet. And also, I'm a mother of 3. Over 3 years, I exclusively breastfed 3 children. So you can do the math there. It was kind of a crazy time. But I'm certainly very sensitive to the issue. I am just a stakeholder at every single level. So with regard to this ordinance, first of all, we want to thank Supervisor Tang and her staff for working with me and our industry leaders on this measure. The amendments that will be considered, and it sounds like the ones that you have just announced today, will make this measure more effective to help working mothers have a convenient location for lactation in the workplace. We recognize the need for defined lactation locations beyond the state law, and we want employers to be able to provide them in a cost-effective manner. Candidly, we challenged the number of rooms required due to the financial burden and just the pursuit of the highest and best use of the real estate that our tenants and our employees are paying for. So we're continuing to have these conversations with Supervisor Tang's office. And it sounds like a number of the things that we've discussed have made it into the legislation, and we are just very thrilled. With respect to the $1 million threshold for expense, we still would like to make sure that $1 million considers inflation, that we're looking at making sure it's somehow tied to inflation, and that value is based on the value that's listed on the permit. So ultimately, we support this legislation, and we look forward to being a part of its introduction into the market. Thank you so much for your time, and I'm available for any questions you may have.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Thank you. My name is Julia Parrish, and I'm a lawyer at Legal Aid at Work here in San Francisco in our Work and Family Project. And I am here to express our support for this really groundbreaking measure, and thank Supervisor Tang and all of the supervisors for shepherding it through the process. At our Work and Family program, we hear from thousands of workers a year who are struggling exactly with that, how to meet the demands of their family and their workplace. And I hear so often from women who either are too afraid to ask for lactation accommodations or don't understand their rights. They have to give up breastfeeding before they want to because of simple challenges and barriers that they face at work. And I really feel like this legislation, in particular the Anti-Retaliation Project and the protections and the requirement to write and distribute a breastfeeding policy will really help address these problems. As we know, the state and federal law do have some protections for breastfeeding moms, but they don't go far enough, and they don't really address the simple kind of easy fixes that this legislation really does and can really help improve a lot of lives, particularly for low-income workers who experience the greatest disparity in breastfeeding rates and who will really be touched by some of the most common sense provisions of this legislation. So I want to thank you.
Thanks. Next speaker.
Good afternoon. Dee Dee Workman from the San Francisco Chamber of Commerce. I really want to thank Supervisor Tang and Ashley Summers for this groundbreaking, really important piece of legislation that I'm very proud to say that the San Francisco Chamber supports. We may be the only chamber anywhere that would support legislation like this, but it's really important to support working women in the workplace, to support mothers in the workplace, to support working families. The chamber was really focused on a couple of things. One was impacts to small business, because we understand that while many San Francisco small businesses are already providing lactation space for their workers, it might be difficult for some to be able to do that, and we didn't want small businesses set up to fail, and we really appreciate the way you worked with us and with the small businesses in the city to make sure that that wouldn't happen and that their needs would be accommodated. We were also focused on the provisions that apply to new construction and renovated construction. We wanted to make sure that we hit the sweet spot, where you have the right amount of lactation spaces for the number of people likely to need them in a given space, and you've done that as well. And so you've made it feasible for people who are doing these projects to be able to meet the criteria of the ordinance. And we really, really appreciate that. So I'm delighted to say that we support this legislation, and we thank you for it.
Thank you. Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Preeti Rani. I am the Director of Nutrition Services with the Department of Public Health. I'm also the Director of the WIC program here in San Francisco that serves low-income mothers, infants and children until the age of 5. A big part of what we do is support breastfeeding families, and especially breastfeeding moms, as they have this journey towards providing the best nutrition for their babies. We all know that there is benefits to breastfeeding for babies, not only for babies, but also for mothers. But in San Francisco, in spite of these well-known benefits, a lot of our mothers, and especially mothers from low-income families and women of color, there's a steep drop-off in breastfeeding rates. And one of the biggest reasons that they provide us is that they are returning back to work. And these moms usually work in low-paying jobs, and they're returning to work much more sooner, and they don't feel well supported at work. Several moms have expressed that they feel, maybe it's embarrassment or afraid or even guilty to ask for some of this accommodation to take place. And then we also know that the research shows that maintaining breastfeeding while you're working is not only possible, but also likely when a mother feels supported at work. And so for these reasons, we really support this legislation, and I thank Supervisor Tang and Ashley Summer for this really groundbreaking legislation. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker, please.
Good afternoon. My name is Shelley Rawlings-Fine. I'm the Family Support Program Officer at First 5 San Francisco, a certified lactation educator, counselor, and I'm also a resident of San Francisco who is a mom of 2 kids, and both of whom I breastfed and was able to sustain that breastfeeding through my employer supporting my efforts to have lactation in the workplace. Thank you, Supervisor Tang, for your championing of this legislation. The best way to create a more equitable city is to make sure every baby and young child has what they need to be healthy, grow, and learn. Years of research has proven that babies' brains develop most rapidly in the first 5 years of life, and this development is supported by breastfeeding. Helping parents provide the health and brain-boosting benefits of breast milk through family leave and lactation support at the workplace is a great contributor to the health and well-being of our city. Families need to know where to turn, and employers need to know how to support their breastfeeding employees. Right now in San Francisco, while many employers have good intentions, there's no clear mandate to help families ensure they can access their state and federally protected rights at time off to pump. As a result, some parents get quality pumping facilities while others do not. We can be proud that mothers in the city breastfeed in the days after giving birth, according to census data. About 97% of moms breastfeed at start. Thank you, and have a good day.
Thank you very much. Any other members of the public wish to comment on item number 2? All right, seeing none, public comment is closed. Supervisor Tang?
Thank you. Thank you to all the people who came out to speak today. I think I couldn't have said it any better myself. You really highlight how important this issue is, especially for, again, a lot of women who struggle to come back to work and then to, on top of that, ask for accommodations that they need for their bodies and for their babies. With that said, colleagues, I do have the amendments in front of us today. We will have to continue this item given the amendments, and so I would make a motion to amend and then continue as amended.
Okay, Supervisor.
To the next land use meeting, which I believe is in 2 weeks.
In 2 weeks, June 5th.
Yep, June 5th. Okay, we have a motion by Supervisor Tang. Supervisor Peskin, we can take it without objection. Thanks very much. Mr. Clerk, would you call item number 3, please?
Would you like me to call item numbers 3 and 4
3 and
together,
4,
please?
thank you very much.
Agenda item numbers 3 and 4 are ordinances amending the planning code to reorganize Article 7, delete outdated zoning control tables and related text, require conditional use authorization for specified NCDs and uses, make other technical and clarifying amendments, and making appropriate findings.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. I will turn this over to Supervisor Peskin, who, at his request, we continued this item a few weeks ago, so we could work out some additional amendments. So, Supervisor Peskin, I want to turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Chair Farrell and Supervisor Tang, and I appreciate the extra time that you gave my office to work with the Planning Department, and I particularly want to acknowledge Aaron Starr at Planning for working with my office and thank Lee Hepner in my office. I have before you a number of amendments that are acceptable to planning and have been reviewed by the Planning Commission, which I am happy to go through line by line, or perhaps we can have Mr. Starr give a high-level synopsis and then hear from the public.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin. So, Mr. Starr, maybe we could do that.
I'm sorry, you wanted a high-level synopsis of the ordinance?
Of the ordinance, maybe just quickly, because we did hear that before,
Sure.
And then I think maybe focus on a high-level synopsis of the amendments themselves.
Sure. So the ordinance would reorganize Article 7 so that it conforms to the new use definitions that we've consolidated into Section 102 and reformats the tables for those districts to also conform with the tables that we did for Article 2. It's Phase 2 of the Code Reorganization Project. Phase 1 was Article 2, Phase 2, Article 7, obviously, and then Phase 3 will be Article 8 coming up. So I believe Supervisor Peskin's amendments have mainly deal with some questions over formula retail, as well as some clarification amendments that he wanted to make to the North Beach Neighborhood Commercial District and Special Use District, as well as one change to the Broadway Neighborhood Commercial District. Planning's changes are basically just some clerical ones and clarification changes. So.
Okay. Colleagues, any questions or comments? Okay, we'll move on to public comment on items 3 and 4. I have 2 speaker cards, Tom Radulovich, Eileen Boken. Anybody else, please line up. We'll have 2 minutes to speak.
Eileen Boken, District 4 resident. In opposition to the legislation as currently drafted, despite the fact that it is supported by the District 4 supervisor. For each of the commercial corridors in District 4, there is a provision for rear yards above, emphasis on the word above, the ground floor. Staff has never explained how this provision would actually work. The legislation also contains restaurant sub-districts for Terraville. These sub-districts were intended to prevent an overconcentration of restaurants. Although at one time this may have been a pressing concern, I believe that currently a more pressing concern is vacant storefronts. and the number of vacant storefronts could increase as a result of a number of factors. One factor is the Muni Forward El Terraville Rapid project, which the District 4 supervisor supports. Another factor is the Affordable Housing Density Bonus Program and its reincarnation, the Affordable Housing Bonus Program, also known as Home SF, which the District 4 supervisor is the sponsor of this legislation. The Article 7 legislation, in combination with the Home SF legislation, as well as the Muni Forward project, could have significant impacts on the viability of District 4 commercial corridors. And an overarching question is, how are Article 7, Home SF, and Muni Forward interrelated? Thank you.
Thank you very much. Next speaker.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Tom Radulovich, Executive Director of Livable City. We're very pleased to see this piece of legislation coming forward. If you really understand what's in it, it's actually fairly unexciting in one way. There's no substantive change proposed with these amendments, but it's exciting in another way in that we have a city agency that is very systematically going through and trying to make one of our city's codes, the Winchester Mystery House of City Codes, our planning code, a lot more accessible to the public. We have 111 zoning districts. We have hundreds of uses defined. And there's reasons why we do all of that. But if we're going to have that level of complexity, if we're going to have that mass customization of our planning code, we need some consistent organization, because if it's badly organized, if things are in different places, if they're hard to find, if the controls for various zoning districts and various sections are inconsistent or hidden in different places, then nobody really knows what's going on. The public are disempowered, planners are disempowered, developers and project sponsors are disempowered. The people who are empowered are a group of land use attorneys who have been the keepers of this code for a very, very long time. So we think improving the legibility of our code, improving its organization, is a great step forward, and it's going to allow us to do things where we want to or need to make the code more complex. We can add that complexity without the whole edifice, like this big game of bureaucratic Jenga, falling down. We can add that additional complexity while maintaining clarity about what the current rules are. So this has been a long time coming. We thank Supervisor Peskin for his diligence in looking through all this and finding the North Beach amendments that make sense for that neighborhood. But we ask you to please pass it, and let's get on to the next piece of cleanup. Thank you.
Thanks very much. Any other members of the public wish to comment on items 3 or 4? Seeing none, public comment is closed. I like that comment, the bureaucratic Jenga. Supervisor Tang.
Thank you. Thank you very much to planning staff and for also working with Supervisor Peskin on this current version that's before us. I just wanted to address some of the comments made by a District 4 resident. Just to clarify, well, first of all, we did duplicate the file and sever out the District 4 portions of Article 7 already, and that just essentially created a conditional use requirement for certain uses, such as massage on the second floor, liquor stores, bars, medical cannabis dispensaries. Again, not a prohibition, just a conditional use requirement. We do not change anything else about the corridor. So any mention about rear yard exceptions and so forth, those are not changes that are being made to this legislation. So I just wanted to make that abundantly clear. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang. Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you to the folks at Planning, and if you are comfortable, I would like to move the amendments that are before you and then send the item as amended to the full board with recommendation.
And to be clear, this is your amendments for item number?
Item number 3.
Great. And then item number 4 without amended. Correct. Amendments can go forward. Okay. So we have a motion by Supervisor Peskin. Likewise, I want to thank the Planning Department for their work on this, as well as Supervisor Peskin for his diligence in getting these through.
I neglected to also acknowledge Deputy City Attorney Judy Boyajian for putting a lot of time into all of these unsexy changes for hundreds of pages.
Okay. Well, thank yous behind us. We have a motion by Supervisor Peskin, and we can take that motion without objection. All right. Mr. Clerk, would you call items 5 and 6 together, please?
Agenda item numbers 5 and 6 are ordinances amending the planning code to revise the amount for the inclusionary affordable housing fee and the on-site and off-site affordable housing alternatives and making appropriate findings. Item number 5 requires a minimum dwelling unit mix in all residential districts, and item number 6 adds reporting requirements for density bonus projects.
Okay, thank you very much, Mr. Clerk. Let me suggest this. I was going to allow the sponsors of both items to speak. Neither are here at the moment.
I'm happy to. Let me start as they...
So we will allow Supervisor Peskin to pinch hit here for one of these items.
Absolutely. So let me, if I may, pinch hit on both of them and acknowledge the last 2 weeks of negotiations, and I want to especially thank my co-sponsor of item number 6, Supervisor Kim, as well as the sponsors of the other items, Supervisors Safai and Breed. For those of you who have not read the papers, we have been playing a 2-week game of tag team intensive negotiations and announced last Wednesday night that, number one, we have come up with a way to live within the bounds of the fiscal feasibility study that we agreed to in the wake of the passage in June of 2016 of Proposition C, and I can regale you with those details. There has been a massive amount of drafting, and I want to acknowledge Kate Stacy from the City Attorney's Office, who has been working on this relentlessly. We have a rough draft of a consensus amendment, but as was pointed out just an hour ago, there are still reference changes and things that need to be cleaned up. And so after hearing from the public, it is our collective intent, I think I can say that on behalf of the 4 sponsors, to introduce an item, give the city attorney 24 hours to work on that, put that online. The public will have a chance to see that and bring it back here to committee on June the 5th. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I know we keep clogging up your calendar, but I'm very pleased that, and Supervisor Safai has joined us, that at a high level we have agreement on AMIs and on banding and a whole host of things, and I want to thank everybody, particularly the folks that each side brought to that room over the last 2 weeks for their help in getting us to a consensus solution that lives within the bounds of fiscal feasibility. And I am hopeful that when we fine-tune this thing over the next few days, that when it gets to the board, perhaps we will have a unanimous consensus vote.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin. We are now joined by Supervisor Safai. Thank you for being here, and we'll turn over to you before we turn over to our planning department.
Great. I'm just gonna reiterate some of the things that Supervisor Peskin said. I think that this is an incredibly difficult piece of legislation. It's over 40 pages long. There's a lot of different eyes on it. We have our city economists. We have our city attorneys. We have multiple supervisors' offices. We have the mayor's office of housing. We have the planning department. We have other supervisors that aren't sponsors that are trying to get looks at it. We have members of the public. We have the labor community. We have all types of advocates. So I just want to reiterate a lot of what he said in the sense that we are, I think we're over 98% of the way there. There are some technical things that need to be looked at. We were advised by the city attorney that the best move to do would be to continue this after we've made the vast majority of our introductions. I think that the things that we do agree on and I think are rock solid are that our AMI levels are at the right place, our percentages are at the right place, our feasibility is at the right place. I think there's some 1 or 2 outstanding things that we're trying to work on. We've also gotten some messages from folks that had previous agreements that want us to take a second look so that we're not undermining anything that was previously negotiated, and I think that's fair. But at the end of the day, I think the principle of putting a piece of legislation forward that for the first time creates 3 distinct categories, that recognizes the hard work of working men and women in this city, working people, and that we have an opportunity to do something that's there for working families and middle-class families and expand the definition of affordable housing. I think we all are in agreement. Supervisor Kim, Supervisor Peskin, Supervisor Bree, Supervisor Tang, all the co-sponsors together collectively agree that this is the right way to move forward. So I feel very confident in that, and I appreciate all the members of the public that have come out and come to speak today.
Okay, thank you very much. At this point in time, we will have our planning department. We have Director Ram here, and then Mr. Egan. So, Director Ram, we'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Supervisors. John Ram with the Planning Department. I will just make a couple of introductory comments. First, congratulations on the fruitful results of your discussions over the past couple of weeks. I look forward to seeing all the details. We're here today, though, to present the Planning Commission's recommendation on the inclusionary housing ordinance. To be clear, what the Planning Commission did was not comment on one ordinance or the other, but made recommendations on the specifics of how they believe the inclusionary ordinance should work. They relied heavily on the Controller study and the Technical Advisory Committee that reviewed that study and commented on that study in their recommendations. But just to reiterate, the Planning Commission's recommendations are based on what they believe are the best set of policies moving forward, not whether one ordinance or another was most appropriate. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Jacob Bintliff of the department to go over the details of the Commission's recommendations. Thank you.
Supervisors, good afternoon, and thank you. I'm Jacob Bintliff with the Planning Department. Appreciate this opportunity to briefly go over the Commission recommendations from the Planning Commission, as well as give a little bit of context for the inclusionary program. Could we have the computer, please? Thank you so much. First of all, the inclusionary program has been around for 15 years, since 2002. It's been responsible for 4,600 affordable units over that time, which represents about 1 in 5 of our affordable units in San Francisco. Thank you. That includes about 2,600 of our on-site units. It also includes units produced through $210 million of the affordable housing fee that's been raised over that time. So it is an important program. There are a couple things that distinguish the inclusionary program from our other affordable housing programs. The first is that we can provide additional affordable units with no use of public subsidy. We can also use this program to target any income level that is appropriate. Why is that so important? As you've heard some discussion already, and also at previous presentations here and at the Planning Commission, we're looking at the area of our affordable housing need that is least served by our current programs. Currently, 80% of all of our affordable housing programs serve folks that are below 60% of AMI, and only 20% serve folks who are above 60% of AMI. That's why this area that's highlighted in red here represents what we're referring to as the least served need. This is what the Planning Commission was looking at as they weighed their recommendations. Again, how does the inclusionary program fit into that? This pie chart, the blue area on here is the housing that serves folks that are over 60% of AMI. As you can see, the inclusionary program really straddles the line. About 2/3 of the inclusionary program actually serves units that are below 60% of AMI, and only about 5% serves folks that are above 60% of AMI. So again, it's an important piece of the puzzle. It serves both low-income and moderate-income San Franciscans. What has happened over the past 12 months to get to these recommendations? First and foremost, of course, we began with Proposition C in the trailing legislation in June of last year, which set temporary requirements pending the findings of the Controller's financial feasibility study. Those temporary requirements for the first time introduced the notion of having moderate income units included in the inclusionary program. Secondly, in February of this year, we had the Controller's feasibility study. The findings of that study were published. We'll hear a little bit more from Ted Egan, the city's chief economist, on that in a moment. But first and foremost, this study put down what would be the maximum feasible inclusionary requirement, both in terms of the on-site and the fee. Finally, after a series of 3 hearings between February and April of this year, the Planning Commission issued a full set of recommendations to achieve a workable inclusionary program that would meet various policy goals. So again, first, the Commission recommendations, first and foremost, what would be the requirement? The Commission went with the structure of Prop C, keeping smaller projects of 10 to 24 units, having no change from the old 12% on-site or 20% for the fee. For larger projects, the Controller study and the Commission recommended that we not exceed the maximum feasible amount that was found in the controller study. And I want to emphasize that that was 18% and 20% for condominiums on site, but that also the controller study showed what was the maximum feasible fee percentage, the equivalent amount, which would be 23% for rental units, or no more than 28% fee for condominium units. Secondly, the Commission recommended a schedule of annual increases that to this requirement that not begin any sooner than 24 months after the effective date of this ordinance, that it increase by 1% every other year, and that there be a maximum amount specified in the ordinance so we know where the schedule of annual increases would be ending. The Commission recommended ending at 23% on-site and 28% off-site or fee for rental, 25% or 33% on-site or off-site for condominiums. Planning Commission also recommended a thorough set of determination and sunsetting requirements for this that would basically give a project 3 years from the time of entitlement to its first construction document before its rate would be increased. Commission also recommended that we look at changing the affordable housing fee from the current system in which it is based on your unit composition in your building and simply switch to a system in which we assess the affordable housing fee based on your total residential square footage. This would make it so that the affordable housing fee is assessed in a way that is proportional to the size of the building no matter what the distribution of units is. On that as well, I want to indicate that while the Commission did recommend that change, staff has been looking at what impact that kind of change might have on projects, and if the board were to take this recommendation, our analysis suggests that it might be advantageous to have some thought as to grandfathering provisions for this, as it could amount to a pretty substantial change in the amount of fee for projects that are relatively late in their entitlement process. Finally, the income levels from the Planning Commission recommending the 3 distinct tiers for larger projects, running from 55% up to 110% at the moderate income level for rental projects, and running from no lower than 90% for condominium projects and up to 140% for condominium projects. Here's some of the incomes that would be served at those income levels. I just want to point out at the very bottom there, you can actually see what the market rate or what the BMR rents are that are associated with those. So if we're talking about somebody at 80% of AMI, we're talking about someone who's guaranteed an affordable rent of $1,800 per month for a one-bedroom unit in San Francisco. You don't see those very often on Craigslist. Market rate rents are up above $3,500 per unit. So while some of these incomes may sound higher than we're used to talking about for inclusionary, when we look at where the market is, we really find that there's still an enormous gap between what the market's providing and what our BMR units are providing, even up at 80% and 110% of AMI. Finally, in terms of the state density bonus, the Planning Commission recommended that we cannot assume that every project will use the full bonus of 35%, and so the requirements in inclusionary in Section 415 should be feasible for projects, whether they use a state bonus or not. The Planning Commission also recommended assessing the affordable housing fee on bonus units in the event that a state bonus is taken for a project. Planning Commission also recommended some additional administrative requirements to the Planning Department to make sure that we're requesting reasonable documentation and also providing current information to the Planning Commission about the use of the state density bonus law. The final point from Commission was regarding the unit mix requirement. Planning Commission recommended that a unit mix requirement, if it applies, should only apply to the total units in the project, not only to the on-site BMR units. Also, that it should not exceed a total of 40% large bedroom requirement or large unit requirement, and that 10% of that should be a 3-bedroom requirement. In summary, from Planning Commission, we had no recommended change in the application of the program, still applying only to projects of 10 units and above, with smaller units below 25 units and larger units above 25 units. Changing the inclusionary requirements to ensure that they remain within the feasible range as demonstrated in the controller study, which we'll hear about in a moment. Planning Commission recommended income levels that hit all 3 tiers and still serve folks that are well below what's attainable in the market. Recommended a schedule of annual increases that would give projects time to adjust to these significant increases in the requirement from where they had previously been. Commission also recommended state density bonus law provisions that would make this reasonably implementable in the face of the state density bonus law and unit mix requirements that would be feasible and supportable for projects. Myself and others from the Planning Department are here, of course, to answer any other questions, along with staff from the Mayor's Office of Housing. Thank you so much for your time. I believe I'm now going to turn it over to Mr. Ted Egan.
Thanks. Just quick question before you do that. So
Yes,
I understand there's some concerns about the new requirements being applied to pipeline and entitled projects, specifically around the new unit mix and fee calculation method. Can you talk about that a little bit?
Absolutely. Regarding the unit mix requirement, because this is a pretty much a brand new concept that was never included in the inclusionary program before and is actually proposed as a new section of the planning code. It would be section 207.7. We were concerned that some projects that might be very near entitlement or may have been recently entitled might actually have to return to the Planning Commission if they determine that they're unable to physically meet the requirements. Therefore, staff looked at this and thought that a reasonable grandfathering might be to draw the line at January of 2016, which is already where the line is drawn from Prop C and N415 now. And this would be, again, to help projects that are currently in the pipeline, may have been recently entitled, that would be seeing new dwelling unit mix requirements where they had previously not existed. There was a separate matter regarding the issue of the fee change, and we were simply noting that the change in methodology of the fee to a per gross square foot amount would actually be, for some projects, significantly higher than we had previously realized once we started running the numbers. So staff has simply looked at that and said, if that piece were to go forward, moving to gross square footage, that it would be reasonable to think about where that line should be drawn as well. Again, Prop C is drawing the line of grandfathering in January of 2016. So we're simply highlighting that issue. It's at your consideration, of course.
Okay. Supervisor Safa, you're on the mic, on the roster here?
Say, oh, no.
All right.
I'm ready to call.
Supervisor Kim?
Thank you. I just had a question for planning on that last point. Being that Proposition C set the inclusionary rate at 25%, so much higher than what we'll be moving forward to, why would developers have assumed otherwise? So I understand the unit mix. Of course, that is a new requirement. That wasn't in Proposition C, and that has a financial cost. But in many ways, developers should have been planning for 25% because that was the law. And now we're actually moving down to 18% if they submitted their EA after January 12th, 2016. So I'm curious why there would be even, a conversation about grandfathering those projects in.
Right, and this was, that's absolutely right. This was in particular looking at the change in methodology of the fee to that per gross square footage fee. The policy logic there was to make projects pay proportionally, whether they have very large units or very small units, right? When we looked at that, it was that actual change in the methodology of the dollar amount of the fee, which was something that was not contemplated in Proposition C, but has been brought to the table subsequently and is now included in at least one of the measures, and was the Planning Commission recommendation. Yes.
So versus, it's not the on-site, but that we may grandfather in projects between January 12th, 2016 and January 1st, 2018 at the 30%. Using the old methodology based on unit mix, not on square footage.
That's correct. And we are specifically talking about when would you apply the per unit versus the square footage amount.
Got it.
The percentages themselves, they are laid forth in 415 as it is.
I understand. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Colleagues, any further questions for planning right now? Okay. Mr. Egan?
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Ted Egan from the Controller's Office. The week before last, our office released an economic impact report on the then current versions of both of the items before you today. I'm not going to go through our full report in detail, but I'm going to go through the highlights, and I'm happy to take any questions you have about our conclusions. This chart here shows the key differences between the two pieces of legislation as they were most recently introduced. It's actually the third version of the Kim Peskin proposal and the first version of Safai Breed Tang proposal. And we're also showing the current law Proposition C on the same issue. So when it comes to projects of 10 to 24 units, Prop C left it essentially as it was before Prop C at 12% on-site, 20% fee. The Kim Peskin proposal raises only the on-site requirement for that of 0.75% a year. The Safai Breed Tang proposal keeps the percentages the same but raises the income limits. For the fee for projects that are 25 units and above, Prop C established it at 33%. It falls to 30% for rentals under the Kim Peskin proposal and falls to 28% for ownership and 23% for rentals under the Safai Breed Tang proposal, which would also then increase the fee 0.5% a year for 10 years. For the on-site requirement for the large projects of 25 units or more, it was set at 15% for low income and Prop C and 10% on top of that for moderate income for a total of 25%. In the Kim Peskin proposal, that rises to 27% for ownership projects, a 15-12 split, and falls to 24%, a 15-9 split for rental projects. In the Safai Breed Tang proposal, it is 20% for ownership projects with an average AMI, 18% for rental, and again would increase 0.5% a year for 10 years. The income limits are also different, and also different from Proposition C, which established a low income of 55% of AMI for rentals and 80% for condos. Moderate is 100 and 120%. Essentially, those are the same in the Kim Peskin proposal. The Safai Breed Tang proposal raises those to an average of 80% for rentals and 120% for ownership. We have modeled, for the purposes of this report, the economic impact of the proposals is essentially a trade-off of two different things. Higher inclusionary requirements tend to affect the cost of development, and raising those requirements raises the cost of development, which on the margin could affect the feasibility of housing production and reduce the overall amount of market rate housing, including inclusionary housing in the city. On the other hand, higher inclusionary requirements increases the amount of affordable housing within each unit. And so the economic impact is essentially a trade-off between these two things, and that's what we've attempted to model in this report. When our office was working on the financial feasibility study that was referred to earlier, we worked with a team of 3 consultants and an 8-person technical advisory committee, and we really put 2 approaches before this group from the consultants on how to estimate this. The first approach, which is the most common approach, is to look at sample project financials, sample pro formas, and essentially apply different requirements to those and see how it affects the financial feasibility of those projects given a developer's cost for land. The second approach involved building a statistical model that really looked at all the parcels in the city, not a sample of them. The model was less detailed, had less variables, but allowed an answer to the question of how do changing requirements affect overall housing production in the city. We used both of these things before the Technical Advisory Committee. The second one is much more suited to answer the question of this economic impact study, and that's why we relied on it for the conclusions of this report. But I do want to emphasize and reiterate some of the conclusions from our feasibility study that we issued in February. This is a chart that shows for ownership and rental projects on-site and the fee, what the recommended ranges were in blue, and then where the 2 proposals land. Essentially what this is showing is that we recommended a range for rental on-site between 14 and 18%, and the Safai proposal comes in at the top of that, and the Kim Peskin proposal made recommendations that are in excess of that. And all of the other 3 also have the Safai proposal, Safai Breed Tang proposal, coming in at the top of our feasible ranges, and the Kim Peskin proposal coming in above that. A couple of qualifying points, though. The income limits in the Safai proposal are somewhat higher than we assumed when we were modeling the financial feasibility. We made clear in our report we didn't have recommendations about what the right income limits were, but we wanted to make clear what we were assuming. It's also important to point out that our study did not make any assumptions about the use of the state density bonus, which I'll talk about on the next slide. The state density bonus essentially makes projects more profitable and allows a higher percentage of inclusionary housing. It is true that for the on-site projects, we're an on-site project to take at the state density bonus. The percentages recommended in the or listed in the Kim Peskin proposal would be financially feasible. To say just a couple things about that, what the state density bonus really is state law granting developers to the right to increase the density of their project, essentially the number of units in their project, in exchange for providing affordable housing on site. Because the city's requirements are essentially already higher than what the state requires, that means almost every new housing project in San Francisco that takes the on-site option, which is required for the state bonus, could qualify for some state density bonus. The city is prohibited from requiring that any of these bonus units are affordable, and also from imposing higher requirements only on the projects that take the bonus. Nevertheless, as I was saying before, a project that did take the bonus could attain the feasible levels that are required in the Kim Peskin proposal, and in fact would be roughly as feasible as one at the top of the Safai Breed Tang requirements. However, a non-bonus project would not be. So we looked at this extensively in the financial feasibility report process. We didn't reach any conclusion about how widely this bonus would be used in the future at this point. Thus far, they've not been widely used in San Francisco. It's also important to point out that under the Safai Breed Tang proposal, a project that does take the density bonus would have to pay the fee option on the bonus units. A bonus project would therefore contribute more to affordable housing than a non-bonus project. So I was saying earlier, we used the statistical model to estimate the citywide impact on housing production under the different proposals. And the key variable in that model is basically the price of housing. If the requirements for inclusionary housing, which is a cost to developers, goes down, on the margin some projects will be more feasible. And this is essentially showing our estimate of the weighted average cost of development over the next 15 years under Prop C and the Kim Peskin proposal and the Safai proposal. It's basically, and this is for the on-site option only, it's essentially showing the inclusionary housing cost as a percentage of sales price. Under Prop C, current law, and under the Kim Peskin proposal, they would fall in the future, we project, because housing prices generally grow faster than the cost of complying with a certain percentage. The Safai proposal, Safai Breed proposal, would also go down in the future, but not as much because its requirements are increasing. And so, in fact, the cost of developers would stay more or less the same over a 15-year period. I won't go into great detail on this. There's a lot of uncertainty involved in projecting future housing demand. We created a series of 9 different housing scenarios regarding what housing prices will do in the future, what the mix of rental and ownership units will be, what percentage of projects will use the state density bonus, and so forth. And we ran the 2 proposals against Prop C to see what the differences would be. And they're contained in these tables here. Essentially, the Kim Peskin proposal has relatively small differences from Prop C, slightly more housing produced, but not a tangible effect on housing prices, a little bit more spending on affordable housing, slightly more increase in affordable housing units. The differences are much bigger with the Safai Breed Tang proposal, somewhere between 4.7 and 7% more housing, which translates into a housing price reduction across the city of between 0.1 and 0.8%. Consider the number of housing units in the city and how much that spends. That translates into between 15 and 98 million in savings for people who are looking for housing and moving within San Francisco per year. So that is essentially the economic benefit of that proposal relative to Prop C. On the other hand, because the percentages and the requirements are lower, there is less affordable housing being produced. We project 5 to 8% fewer units. Because the income limits are higher, the annual subsidy, which is basically the difference between what a household that receives a BMR unit, an affordable unit, has to pay versus what they would pay for a market rate unit that was new. Those subsidies go down because they're going to more moderate income households. And therefore, the total value of the subsidy, which is the number of units times that average subsidy value, goes down as well to $10 or $50 million. So just to summarize, the Safai Breed Tang proposal in every scenario that we considered leads to the production of more housing overall, but fewer affordable housing units. If you were to weigh the savings to households of reduced housing prices to the loss of affordable housing subsidy, there is more gain to essentially market rate housing consumers than there is loss of affordable housing subsidy. The ratio is about $1.45 to $2.50. And the Kim Peskin proposal closely tracks the outcomes that we project for Prop C. I'd be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Mr. Egan. Colleagues, any questions right now? Just a few things that I'd love to go over with you. First of all, thanks to you and the planning staff and everyone for all your work on this. I think obviously everyone cares a lot about affordable housing, our inclusionary program. Obviously, I think to set the context, certainly how I've always looked at this is the program relies on market rate development to fund and create below market rate housing. And obviously the issue is if you overregulate it, as you've analyzed, then you disincentivize market rate housing and you hurt the affordable housing production. And if we really want to alleviate our housing crisis, I do believe we need to be doing both market rate and affordable housing as well. And we want to obviously avoid setting the rate so high that you discourage market rate housing. I'm also very mindful that we're in a very robust economic cycle right now. And what may or may not happen in recession, I think we've talked about in the general budget context before. So a few things, just specific questions. Can you go over the differences between the Technical Advisory Committee report and what's being brought before us today?
Well, what's being brought before you today is the Office of Economic Analysis requirement to do economic impact reports on legislation that would have a material effect on the city's economy. So both of these pieces of legislation are big enough for us to have a reporting requirement related to that, even had we not, as the Controller's Office, done the feasibility study earlier. The general scope of an economic impact study is to look at the economic costs and benefits of things, and we've laid that before you. The financial feasibility was to work with the TAC to identify feasible ranges for inclusionary requirements.
Okay. Perhaps, is that a more appropriate question for planning today, or is this something we want to digest this amendment of the whole and then talk about it at the continued hearing? The differences between the TAC report and what we have in front of what's being presented right now? Because I know as we sit here today, before we accept the amendments, we have two separate versions that are being melded, which is great. But I certainly want to have that discussion. Is that more appropriate today, or is that more appropriate 2 weeks from now?
Thank you, Supervisor Farrell. Yes, as you recognize, of course, we haven't had a chance to look at what the combined proposal might be, but from what we understand, basically, the main things that I think would cause difference from the analysis that Ted's folks produced would be changes to the rate requirement and changes to the AMI. I'd say it's probably fair to say those would be the areas that have the most sensitivity. So as I understand it, the AMIs are generally skewing to about the same proportion that Prop C had, which is what the consultant studied. So in other words, something that was basically sticking to about the kind of 2/3 low-income, 1/3 moderate-income ratio would be the same economic picture as what was studied under the TAC. And of course, as Ted just said, the TAC study did have a maximum of up to 18% for on-site and up to 23% for the fee for rental, or up to 28% for the fee for condominium units. So again, like I say, I haven't seen the combined language, but I would, of course, you can look at what the rate is and see whether it's above or below that number to see whether or not the TAC study found that it was feasible or not feasible.
And I'd just like to reiterate, Supervisor, that our report today is on the originally introduced versions of the legislation. We'd be happy to come back in 2 weeks and with an analysis of the new legislation, if you'd like.
Okay, I think that'd be helpful to go through some of the details. Okay, why don't we take it that way? Again, I appreciate your analysis very much and look forward to that in 2 weeks. Again, I think it's important to take this from my point of view in context. That we want to make sure that we incentivize affordable housing. We want to develop as much as possible, but we can also be overly restrictive and shoot ourselves in the foot as a city, especially as we, at some point in time, will head into an economic downturn and want to make sure that we continue to build a robust pipeline of affordable housing in our city, which is my concern here. So anyways, thank you, and look forward to that discussion down the line. Colleagues, any questions right now for planning for Mr. Egan before we take on public comment? Okay, at this point, we'll take on public comment then for items 5 and 6. Supervisor Safai has
Yeah.
a number of speaker cards that he's going to be calling forward.
Right, I'm just going to call them in the order that we received them. Mark Gleason, Rudy Gonzalez, Christian Pradilla, Alex Lantberg, Calvin Welch,
Good afternoon, Supervisor.
Anthony Urbina, and Jay Streets. Thank you. Proceed, sorry.
Okay. Good afternoon, Supervisors. Mark Gleason, I'm here to extend and add our support for, as Supervisor Farrell described, the melding of these proposals for affordable and inclusionary housing for working people in San Francisco. We are very, very welcoming of the idea that working people who, frankly, are not able to continue to stay in the city will now have an opportunity to have housing. And we're talking about not just delivery drivers that we represent, but construction workers and firefighters, teachers, janitors, and other workers who, through their trade union membership, are fighting for improvements in their working conditions and their wages, but could find themselves otherwise unable to be included in housing that we're talking about under this program. So we want to extend and encourage all of you to continue your talks and put this together. And I would really like to call out the 4 supervisors who've been working on this on both sides, Supervisor Safai and Breed and Tang, excuse me, there's 5, and Supervisors Peskin and Kim, for all working together in this community to try to make sure that working people can stay in San Francisco. So thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon, Mr. Chair and members of the committee and the Board of Supervisors. My name is Rudy Gonzalez. I'm the Teamsters Joint Council 7 and Local 856. We represent about 20,000 Teamsters in San Francisco that live and work in the city, everything from front desk workers at 35 hotels in the city to zookeepers and animal control officers that work for city and county, even to nurse managers and aircraft mechanics who keep us safe in the flying public. And what we're up against these days is what's been described by some as the missing middle. And I think you saw it in the controller's report, and you see it in the TAC and the feasibility analysis, that there are a group of San Franciscans who the market is not providing housing for, and they do not qualify for the major sources of funding and affordable housing that are out there. And it's becoming increasingly difficult for them to find housing options. We cannot rely on the market to produce it alone. We think that the legislation that's being worked on by all of you, frankly, is something that's going to provide for this missing middle. I want to echo what Supervisor Farrell said, because I think there's a test, a balancing act that has to be dealt with. Sadly, neither of the initial proposed pieces of legislation do enough. And I think everybody on every side of every aisle can agree that there is an affordability crisis. I've seen some of you run on that very issue. And I think it's real, and I think that's where you see a lot of the passion in this room and out in the streets. And our members and people in the community need something done. This piece of legislation takes the right step. We think it's the appropriate amount of intervention that's absolutely necessary, not just for the people that a respective union represents, but like issues of living wages and minimum wages, we're speaking on behalf of a whole class of people in the middle that desperately need your leadership and your help. So we look forward to what comes out in future committee meetings and in the Board of Supervisors, and thank you for your leadership on the issue this.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Christian Pradilla with UFCW Local 648. We represent approximately 4,000 working men and women in the city. On behalf of our members, we'd just like to say we are in support of the workforce housing. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Calvin Welch, San Franciscans for Community Planning. The grand compromise that was reached on the assumption that there is one inclusionary housing program in the city, that there would be one requirement made of all new construction, residential construction in the city. That has now been obviated by an amendment made last week, made public, not before the 11th, by Supervisor Tang in creating Home SF as a standalone alternative program to inclusionary zoning. As we all know, for the last 3 years, Home SF, the density bonus, the local density bonus program, was to be an add-on in addition to inclusionary zoning. Supervisor Tang, unbeknownst to certainly us, who've been following the measure for 3 years, introduced legislation that created Home SF as a standalone alternative to the inclusionary zoning program. My belief is that it guts the inclusionary zoning program. It sets aside all of the analysis of financial feasibility of the inclusionary housing program and makes a mockery of any AMI levels reached in some sort of compromise. It is adamantly important that this amendment be rescinded, and that if it is to be a standalone, that it be as equal as possible to the inclusionary zoning requirement, in which it should be amended to include the 30-year requirement for rentals. If you start out as a rental, you have to, under the inclusionary,
Sir, excuse me.
you have to save for
excuse
30.
me, Speaker.
And
Home
the
SF is
last
not on
that
the
it should
agenda
meet,
today.
the requirements, all of the requirements of the inclusionary zoning program.
Thank you. I just want to be clear. Home SF is not on the agenda today, so please stay focused on the item. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisors. My name is Jay Streets. I'm a field representative with the Carpenters Union, and I live in District 5. I want to commend the supervisors for coming to this compromise. We think it's an excellent compromise, and it will help the working men and women in our community continue to stay in San Francisco as they learn a trade, as they increase in the trades, and continue to make more money. We think it's a fantastic program, and we urge you to move forward so that we can start building the housing that we need in San Francisco. Thank you.
Thank you. Before the next speaker, I'm going to call a few more names. So this is Alex, correct? So we have Anthony Urbina, Tony Rodriguez, Paul Weber, and Jen Fiber.
Good afternoon.
Please proceed.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon, supervisors. Alex Landsberg with the Carpenters, District 10 resident. Let me be the first one to say, at least as far as this legislation goes, kumbaya. I think we need to commend y'all for negotiating, compromising, and reaching an agreement that all of the principals can live with. This is something that I don't remember who, but I think it might have been Chair Farrell who mentioned, we're in a bind. We rely on market rate housing to fund affordable housing, yet we can't take such a big bite out of the finances of market rate housing because it threatens to blow up affordable housing. So really what you're trying to do is thread the needle, and it sounds like from everything we've seen through the compromise, or at least from the statements from the various members of the board, is that needle has been threaded. So let's get on with it. Let's pass this legislation and move forward with building. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Tony Rodriguez for Local 43 Fire Sprinklers. Mike Therio couldn't make it today, so he asked me to read this letter. It's addressed to Supervisor Farrell, Peskin, and Tang. And as you know, Emily Johnstone of the AFL-CIO Housing Investment Trust served on the Controllers Committee that made feasibility recommendations per last year's Inclusionary Housing Charter Amendment. Now, as then, Ms. Johnstone has the trust of the San Francisco Building Trades. Accordingly, the Board of Representatives of the Building Trades voted at the meeting of May 9th, 2017, to instruct me to send a letter to the Land Use and Transportation Committee in support of the proposal that resulted from the recent negotiations between Supervisors Breed, Safai, and Tang, and Supervisors Peskin and Kim, if Ms. Johnstone indicated that the proposal was close enough to the recommendations of the Controllers Committee to warrant her support. And she so has indicated. So we support the proposal. Respectfully yours, Michael Therio, Recording Secretary of the Building Trades. I got a couple of seconds left, and I just want to add everything that you've heard here today. I've got a union meeting tomorrow that I was hopefully going to be able to say that we're moving forward with this. We've got workers that work for our union that I'll see tomorrow that have had to move out of the city. We have other workers that live here in the city that their kids will not be able to live here. So I just want to also say that this is the first of its kind that I've been here my whole life. So I commend all four of you, or is it five, that are working on this, and hopefully it'll get resolved. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm just going to call a few more names. So I had Paul Weber, Jen Fiber, Anthony Urbina, Paul Slade, Jose Fuentes, Diego Hernandez.
Good afternoon. My name is Jose Fuentes Almanza. I'm representing IBEW Local 6 lectural workers in San Francisco. Excuse me. I too I'm a native. I'm still a resident, and it's good work you guys are doing. We appreciate it, and we are in full support of this legislation. Thanks for all your hard work, and hopefully this will make it happen pretty soon. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Supervisors, thank you for working on this legislation. My name is David Hooper. I live in District 11, where I've lived for 30 years. I'd like to say that the most important part of this legislation to me is raising the percentage of the AMI. People who make 100% of the AMI aren't middle class in this town. They are working class, especially if it's for a family of four. It doesn't mean they're taking something away from somebody else to be included in the affordable housing package. It means that they're part of the same working class in San Francisco. Neighbors come to me all the time who have lived in their homes for 40 years, and they can't get the kids to move out, and the kids have good jobs. This is a step in the right direction. This is going to continue to be something that we have to work with for the next 20, 30, 40 years. It's never going to stop. It's a good start. Thank you.
Next speaker.
I'm Paul Slade. I'm a retired muni operator over 30 years. It's good to see my fellow organized labor people in the audience. We're talking about the backbone of the city. The blue-collar workers, the middle class in the city help build this city. And so many of my fellow muni operators couldn't afford to stay in the city. They had to leave the city because they wanted to raise a family here. If we really do want a diverse San Francisco, if we want a vibrant San Francisco, we have to have economic diversity, and we have to have an affordable status for people to actually be part of the city and not have to leave the city. And if we want a city of the rich and the poor, that's where we're moving to. So for the benefit of working class and middle class people, it's very important that they be considered in any affordable housing mix. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Jennifer Fieber with the Tenants Union and also the Anti-Eviction Mapping Project. I support the continuance so that the two programs, Inclusionary and Home SF, can be reconciled. Home SF was always described as additive to the inclusionary program, but last week language was struck through that separates Home SF from inclusionary and makes it an option. I see what you're doing by amending this language. Developers want to distract us with that 30% figure, but once again, you're completely getting the low-income allocation. This process has been really sneaky and unethical. You've already reduced affordable housing from Prop C's 25% down to 18%, so why not let the ink dry before ramming through more developer giveaways? The Planning Department issued a report on Home SF and said that about 5,000 below market units would be created with the density bonus. If you change the allocation percentages of the category, you get less low-income housing. So if inclusionary and Home SF are combined, you get 2,550 low-income units. But if developers are allowed to choose Home SF over inclusionary, there's only 1,666 units. So the income disparity will get even worse with ownership units. goes up to 90% of AMI from where inclusionary is at 80. This has been a major amendment to the public's understanding of the inclusionary program, and it really deserves more public involvement to be heard. So once again, it's time to go back to the drawing board and discuss this with the public and fix this loophole.
Good afternoon. My name is Paul Weber. Excuse me. I'm here on behalf of Coalition for San Francisco Neighborhoods, and my comments relate to the compromise inclusionary housing bill. The program must again be recoupled and integrated with Home SF. This means that if a developer is seeking to develop a multifamily project which reaches the jurisdictional threshold for inclusionary, which I understand is to be 25 units, and is seeking a density bonus, then the two must be coupled such that the project generates 30 affordable on-site units. This would mean, for example, in a 100-unit building, there would be 18 units of affordable from the inclusionary side of the project and 12 units of affordable from the Home SF side of the projects. This was how the documents for the two programs were intended to work. But one of the versions of one of the documents was amended to eliminate the coupling requirements without indicating why or who was behind the recoupling. What difference does it make, you might ask? Isn't 30% affordable achieved anyway if Home SF bonus is sought? The inclusionary program has a wider range for means tests than does Home SF, meaning that it goes farther down the means test range, as was just illustrated a minute ago. As a consequence, there's a credible concern that developers will opt for the tighter means of Home SF and ignore inclusionary program. Finally, the governing documents for both programs must be fly-specced to get rid of inconsistencies and ambiguities. For example, the Planning Commission's role under Home SF is limited, very limited, and it has its own AHBP design guidelines, which will control with this sort of coupling. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Tom O'Connor with the San Francisco Firefighters. I just want to speak out on behalf of firefighters and police officers and first responders and say thank you very much for moving forward with this important legislation to help keep the people who serve and protect this city in the city that they love so much, and to help keep working families in this city. And while City Hall is more than generous with the city workers and with police and firefighters, we find that the economic reality out in the streets is outpacing us and keeping it from staying in San Francisco. So on behalf of firefighters and police officers, I want to say thank you. And on a side note, I also want to commend you for the spirit of cooperation and compromise that you're demonstrating, which seems to be values that have disappeared from modern politics. So thank you for that.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon. My name is Diego Hernandez, and I'm with Labor's Local 261 here in San Francisco. Some of my brothers and sisters are in the crowd, and we are in support of this collaboration. We'd like to thank Kim, Supervisor Kim, Supervisor Peskin, Tang, Supervisor Asha, and London Breed that are collaborating to get this going. We also have a union meeting coming up soon, so we can't wait to let our members know that that's moving forward, and we'll be here back again to show our support. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Good afternoon. Anthony Urbina with the Sheet Metal Workers Union, Local 104, and I want to start by thanking all the supervisors that are putting themselves together here and really working together and making this thing move forward for us. Sheet Metal Workers, we stand in support with the Building Trades Council and support this inclusionary affordable housing. It's really important that our members and our San Francisco residents are able to afford here and live here in San Francisco. So we just like, again, thank you guys for working together and really making this teamwork. Thank you.
Thank you. I'm going to call a few more names before the next speaker. Chad Houston, Dennis Moscafian, Rufus Watkins, Fernando Marti, Tess Welburn, Deepa Varma.
Good afternoon.
Thank you.
Supervisors, Corey Smith on behalf of the San Francisco Housing Action Coalition. We, like many others, understand their deal has been reached. Two brief comments. First of all, as referenced a number of times earlier regarding the grandfathering of previous projects related to the square footage and unit count, we just ask for a clean grandfathering and not have the rules change again for projects that have been in the pipeline. And then number two, how are we going to deem whether or not these policies are successful? What metrics are we driving towards to actually figure out if we have built the amount of affordable housing that we desire for low, middle, and San Franciscans of all income levels? So because we do have quality data and we continue to accumulate quality data, we ask that our policies going forward are data-driven. What does success look like? How can we all get on the same page with that? Perhaps we can avoid some future infighting if we look at these numbers. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hello, Supervisors. Dennis Moscofini here. I want to let you know that I am fully in support of this tremendous effort that a whole series of you have engaged in order to reach some sort of consensus. I am concerned, however, that that the consensus that you've reached in the inclusionary, which is so vital for all of us, is going to be ignored by developers when they find that they can opt out and ignore the inclusionary because it's been decoupled from by an amendment last week at Home SF. And I don't know how you're going to figure out how it is that the value that you've created in the consensus that you've worked on is going to be honored by the developer when the developers have a way of avoiding it. So it seems to me that what's fundamental is that you recouple and make sure that the inclusionary program that you reach is the base that it's always been intended to be, and that the density bonus program is an added feature that can be used by a developer if so choose. And as a result, I think it's also important to make sure that the kind of prohibition on converting rental condos is also included in the Home SF so that it doesn't undermine the inclusionary. But thank you.
Next speaker.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. I wanted to say I'm a proud union member. I want to say congratulations on the hard work with the planning controllers and the unions and so on and so forth. Again, my name is Rufus Watkins. I'm with Neighbors United. That's number one. Number two, I grew up in San Francisco. I was very fortunate to have a strong African-American mother who sacrificed to put me to St. Ignatius, the same school that Mr. Farrell went to high school at. So the goal is I support the continuance of the program. That's number one. That's part of the package I'm talking about. But I have a couple questions. If you're going to have I admire Supervisor Kim and I admire Supervisor Ronan about the further study of the Tenderloin and the Mission. You are having neighborhoods compete. They're going to look at it and say, why are they getting a benefit, a further study, and what a further study means. To me, that's a very, make it very decisive, very divisive in the city of San Francisco. So if you're going to do one further study in the Mission, and so I'd like to do one further study in District 5, District 10, Supervisor Southeast District, because a lot of people are hurting there. Again, these individuals are union members, firefighters, and so on and so forth. So, again, we have to realize you're dealing with humans and understand understanding a lot of the controller's office and the planning department. But again, you have to understand the impact of humans here. We got numbers, inclusionary, this, that, and so on and so forth. But it's humans here. They need your help. So I think you need a continuance, go back to the drawing board, and again, work on that further study. If you don't do one, you got to do it for all. Again, thank you for the opportunity, and I appreciate it. And again, I'm very appreciative of all the union members, Teamsters, and so on and so forth. I was part of the CWA local paper guild, so I understand. And growing up in San Francisco, going to St. Ignatius.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Again,
thank you. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. It's great to see you all again. It's been a long couple of weeks of working through these two measures. I want to commend you on just seeing how you all work together to create a consensus measure that can really move forward. As some folks have mentioned before, however, there is a linkage between this and Home SF. And I don't know if you all read your packets from the Planning Commission of various whereases, whereas the Land Use and Transportation Committee, I'm reading page 2 of your packet, from the Commission, renamed the Local Affordable Housing Bonus Program as the Home SF Program and amended, among other requirements, the Home SF Program's average median income levels such that those levels mirror the average median income levels in the ordinance amending the Inclusionary Affordable Housing Program. So what the Planning Commission sent to you in terms of the inclusionary housing reference the fact that Home SF mirrors the same median incomes that were worked through in this long process. I think it's very important that we stay on target as we work towards a consensus that I think many folks from all sides of the political spectrum agree is the right way to move forward, that we make sure that the companion measure, or what had been the companion measure, Home SF, mirrors the income levels. It mirrors the work that we did to recognize the issues that happen when rentals convert to condominiums. And finally, a lot of work was done to understand how land economics allow us to provide an indexing for this process so that our inclusionary housing levels go up over time. What happens when our inclusionary level goes up to, let's say, 27% for condominiums, and our Home SF is only at 30%, allowing...
Thank you. Next speaker. Before you speak, I'm just going to call out a few more names. I know that you're up, Deepa. Tess Welburn, Chad Houston, Renee Curran, Tony Robles, and Laura Clark. Thank you.
Deepa Varma from the San Francisco Tenants Union. I support a continuance until we can reconcile Home SF and the new inclusionary law. You throw a lot of numbers at us, but it doesn't change the fact that you are cutting affordable housing. We cannot believe that now, of all times, you would propose cutting affordable housing requirements by even 1 unit. But you're cutting it for the poor and you're cutting it for the middle class. You're cutting it for every income level that was discussed, including the firefighters, including the teachers, including the low-income folks. And this is while there's an unprecedented crisis. I want to speak to your point, Supervisor Farrell, about how we're in a robust economy right now. That's true. We should be taking advantage of that and getting as much value as we can at the time when more people are being displaced than ever before. We took inclusionary out of the charter so that you could reduce the percentage later if there is a downturn and if there is a problem then. We don't need to do it in advance. We should also... And then, meanwhile, you slipped in more cuts by decoupling inclusionary from Home SF. The very least we could do is continue this so we can figure out how much of a cut you're going to give us in the end of the day. Thank you.
Next speaker.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Peter Cohen, Council of Community Housing Organizations. Just a quick step back in time. Inclusionary housing ordinance was first put into place in 2002 by then Supervisor Mark Leno under his leadership. And, you know, it really always was the city's moderate income housing program. What's changed in 15 years is the conditions on the ground with our real estate market, which is leaving more and more people behind. So I just want to correct the record if there's some sense that this has been frozen in time and always somehow abandoned or ignored the needs of middle-income folks. That's what it was in 2002, and so it's evolved and expanded over time, but I think it's a true statement that the pie is never big enough, nor does it grow fast enough to serve the needs of all working folks, whether they're low-income or middle. So here we are, and that leads to the point of, you know, we support and think you've done a very good job, and we've been helpful to this, of landing on a compromise that really does serve as much as possible a broad range of folks, and that's a good thing. But I just want to make sure we're not sort of reinventing history, that this had never been about San Francisco's moderate income workforce. There were some very important details in this compromise, and you've heard about some of them. Won't repeat what Fernando has said, but the AMI targeting, very importantly, but particularly the ownership side a lot of us don't know as much about ownership housing, and I was glad to see Home Ownership San Francisco and the United Educators, the teachers were involved in those conversations to get the AMI targeting on the ownership just right. They know they can serve it and how to allocate to those different buckets. And of course, the escalator, the annual indexing that allows us to increase our affordable housing as land development value goes up, that's another important piece. And then that insurance that rental condos, or rental BMRs are not going to convert to condos and end up kicking out folks. Just to reiterate what you've heard, though, we are concerned that we have a separate inclusionary ordinance that is not consistent with that. So we do ask that these two mirror each other. If inclusionary is not embedded in Home SF, at least they should mirror each other. Thank you.
Good afternoon, Supervisors. Tess Wellborn from Hank, and also a union household. The real problem with today's hearing is that while the inclusionary compromise that you've reached is the best that we could, it was heard in public, it was negotiated. It's a fair compromise given the current board. But the real problem is that when you do pass it, no developer is going to build under it. They're going to build under this program called Home SF. When it was introduced originally, there was considerable opposition in every San Francisco neighborhood. And now, with the numerous rewrites and without any public hearings, Home SF is up for a vote with the board. There are many issues remaining. And if we're going to have an inclusionary housing program, it should be consistent. We shouldn't have things off to the side that take away from what people have sweated for. Some of the problems with the Home SF program is that it calls for smaller housing units, as small as 700 square feet for a two-bedroom, and we'll end up with a lot more studios, which is not exactly the purpose of family-friendly housing. There's no public review, no public appeal in the process. It allows for smaller backyards, again, not family-friendly as built. And it allows higher income single people to benefit for what should be low income housing for families. It does not increase affordability, but it does increase developer profits, and it has a good chance of decimating our neighborhood commercial and service districts. Please work on having one consistent plan for inclusionary housing to maintain the good record. Thank you.
Hi, Renee Curran with Neighbors United. I also support the continuance and also working toward making Home SF more consistent with the additive as opposed to an alternative. I've been kind of struggling for what to say here because it's just so hard for me to come here week after week and fight for these crumbs. Even the great compromise that everyone has been able to come up with, it's still not enough. I think we really need, after all this is said and done, to look at a different way for funding affordable housing with greater taxes for the wealthy, for instance, cutting into these amazing profits that these developers are making, vacancy taxes, any kind of thing that, I'm just a little bit tired of keep hearing about how we need to have at least 70 or 80% market rate housing to fund the affordable housing when we really just don't even need more market rate housing. Thanks.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hi, my name is Tony Robles. I represent Senior and Disability Action. Our organization represents seniors across San Francisco. The idea of the density bonus now, which is being called Home SF, has been around for several years now, and it's always been seen as an additive to inclusionary rules. It's a bonus so that developers will gain a lot of potential profit on the same size lot. And by changing the language to now say Home SF is independent of the inclusionary program is a substantive amendment deserving of discussion no matter how you cut it. Home SF, it sounds pretty. It's a pretty name and it sounds very innocuous and it sounds inclusive, but does it really serve us well? There's a lot of talk here about the compromises that have been reached between supervisors. From our perspective, serving seniors and people with disabilities, even those numbers are not enough. We see on a daily basis the struggles that seniors have to go through in order to keep their housing, in order to get housing. We're a city that prides itself on a policy of aging in place, and we have to do much better because the low-income seniors, and I'm talking about the low and the low-income seniors, are the ones that are hurting very much and really need we need higher percentages of housing numbers, and that's just coming from our perspective as an organization who serves seniors and people with disabilities. Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
Mi nombre es Alma Paredes, vivo en la calle Pérez y en Excelsior por muchos años.
Good afternoon. My name is Alma Paredes. I live on Persia Street in the Excelsior. I've been there for many years.
Voté yo por usted, supervisor, y olvido las personas de la tercera edad.
I voted for you, Supervisor Safai, and you have forgotten seniors.
Yes. Llevo 4 a 5 años buscando, tengo mucha ansiedad y estrés. No califico para ninguna lotería y en mi vida trabajé en San Francisco.
I've been looking for housing for about 4 to 5 years. This causes me a lot of stress and anxiety, but I don't qualify for any of these lotteries, and I've worked in San Francisco all my life.
Estoy decepcionada y no tenemos nada para las personas de la tercera edad. Espero no nos olvide.
I'm very disappointed that you have forgotten about seniors, and I hope that you won't forget about us.
Gracias.
Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker. Let me say, any other members of the public that have not had their speaker cards read or anybody else wish to comment on this item, please line up on the far wall, and we'll take you as they come. Thanks.
Hi, Laura Clark, YIMBY Action. I have mixed feelings, but I'm generally pleased that you've come to some kind of an agreement. But inclusionary housing does not come anywhere near the need for subsidized affordable housing. You've heard people talking about the desperate need. We're talking about 10% of our subsidized affordable housing, and we need real funding sources. Real funding sources from, for instance, reforming the regressive mortgage interest tax deduction. The city economist has let us know that this policy will increase rents by about 2%, and we will be increasing displacement. But we have a deal, and now we can look for additional solutions to mitigate those effects. We can speed up the production of all housing, and we can address the zoning inequities where a third of the city is zoned single-family home. We've got inclusionary housing. Now we have to deal with exclusionary zoning, because that is what we have most of the city. Most people live in market rate housing, and we really need to address the actual effects that this will have, and really work on things that are going to increase the amount of market rate housing and make it so that market rate is not equal to luxury. Thank you.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Hey, Jen Snyder from Neighbors United. I support the continuance until we reconcile the new inclusionary law coming next week and the Home SF situation. I think it's super wild that we're having this conversation where the board is poised to reduce affordable housing requirements during an affordability crisis from Prop C. Middle income housing is great. You just shouldn't take it from low-income, poor people. You should take it from the developers. They'll keep building. It's fine. For Home SF, we've had density bonuses forever, and it's always been additive. It's a bonus, and you've written a loophole, and it's really sad. Home SF actually avoids the inclusionary housing, the inclusionary housing deal by using this bonus. We already just reduced inclusionary from 25 to 18%, and the voters all agreed that 25% would be good. We didn't need to go back to it at all. Thanks for working together, but we were fine before this entire thing came up. Maybe it's not interesting, how many poor people need houses to live in, but we did vote for it, so maybe it'll be more interesting when elections come back around. I don't know. More affordable housing would be good. Thanks.
Thanks. Next speaker.
Next speaker. Sorry.
Sorry.
Hi, Lori Lederman. It seems a compromise is nearly reached for inclusionary housing. Doubtless, negotiators on both sides advocated tirelessly. As a former union negotiator, I know the mixed feelings of reaching a settlement. Acceptance, best we could do. Satisfaction, it's better than it was when we started. Relief, it's over. Self-doubt, we could have done better. Regret and worry, the voters supported an increase for the low end of AMI, and we didn't achieve that. I respect the hard work, but let's raise the percentage for the lowest AMI level in the final deal. And meanwhile, the full board is poised to vote on Home SF, a measure that has been so fundamentally amended as to completely undermine this negotiated deal. For 3 years, as the affordable housing density bonus was modified into Home SF, it was always additive to our inclusionary ratios, not separate from them. But the May 11 amendment, authored after public comment was closed, severs that connection and sets unrelated ratios that incentivize developers to bypass this inclusionary deal. For today's grand bargain to be meaningful, the May 11 amendment to Home SF must be rescinded, and Home SF's relationship to inclusionary as an additive program must be restored, and it must include a 30-year prohibition on condo conversions consistent with current inclusionary rules. Please don't let Home SF undermine this grand bargain.
Thank you, Supervisors. Dennis Antonori. I've followed both of these pieces, or all three of these pieces of legislation, as they have changed over the last few years, and I've attended many of the hearings, and I've been very conscientious about participating and about stating my views and about trying to influence the outcome. Last week, I attended the final hearing on the Home SF program, and was told that it was going to be referred to the full board for a final vote. And yet, the very next day, I find out, actually 2 days later, I find out that there's a major amendment to that which really undermines, as other people have stated, the legislation that you're considering today. It is really reprehensible. It is not a way to conduct public policy to have amendments that have never been discussed in public, that have never had any exposure to the light of day and to discussion and consideration. That's not the way to conduct the public's business, and I urge you to please reopen the Home SF issue as it relates to this question, and give the public a fair chance to consider this and to talk about it and to express our views on it. That is really essential. If you proceed the way you're proceeding now, you're slapping the public in the face and you're slapping the whole process in the face.
Hello, my name is Teresa Imperial. I'm from the Veterans Equity Center Builds Our Housing Program. We appreciate the supervisors that worked hard on the negotiation for Prop C. However, we still feel discontent on the result when it comes to low income. The fact that 12% for 55% AMI, which is now reduced to 10%, and then from the bandwidth from 4% AMI to 65% AMI, 91% of our clients are in those ranges, which are in 60 or 65% AMI. And to reduce that, it is very heartbreaking. We know that our seniors don't get any senior housing, and the working class that are in the service industries, they are in those ranges, and that's about 91% of our clientele. And I know that the supervisors work hard to index it aggressively, but it will be until 2 years to get it back to 12%. And it takes about another 12 years, I believe, to get into 24%. I know it's a hard negotiation. It's very, very hard. But we should be striving, especially the authors should be striving for higher AMIs, especially that was passed under the Prop C ballot. Thank you.
Supervisors, Lorraine Petty here. I'm a member of Senior and Disability Action and also D5 Action. I support the continuance, and I support the original Kim Peskin proposal. I'm one of the 67% of San Franciscans who voted for Proposition C and defeated Props P and U. We voted to have both low-income and middle-income units, with the biggest percentage going to those of low income. The compromise reduces the low-income unit percentage, which needs to be raised faster in the future. But I'm very alarmed at what has been reported to be a secret amendment with no public hearing, which allows the density bonus program called Home SF to completely supersede the inclusionary housing requirements. Do not let this density bonus program replace inclusionary housing. All of us proudly declare that we are a sanctuary city for our immigrants, and rightly so. But we also need to proudly declare sanctuary for our poor, most of whom, let us not forget, work. Our elders and our people with disabilities. Why? Because we all know that these are the first to be driven from the city, the first to be evicted, the first to be priced out. They have the least money and the fewest options. We know that Washington wants to cut all aid to low-income housing. We need you to show our children and our grandchildren that we abide by our voter mandates. We are still a democracy, even if in Washington it is not.
Before the next speaker, I'm just going to call a couple names. Tess Welburn, if they haven't already spoken, Renee Curran, Tony Robles, and Lori Liederman, and Teresa Flandrich.
That's me.
Flandrich, sorry.
Yep.
Go ahead.
Called these. Okay. Teresa Flandrich from Senior and Disability Action. I know that you all worked very hard on this, and I can appreciate the delayed meals, the delayed bedtimes. However, I am really disappointed that that our low-income seniors and the people that I know that work on the wharf in my neighborhood can no longer afford to live here. And they are the ones that most need the housing and have the fewest choices as to what they can do. So I just needed to acknowledge my disappointment. I do support continuance. I do want to hear both the inclusionary housing and the Home SF discussed at the next meeting. I am very disappointed with the Home SF as a cutting out, a whole different amendment for something that is not about San Franciscans. So as my great aunt Frida would say, I do hope there will be a public hearing about Home SF where the public will be invited and that we will be dazzled by brilliance and not by baloney. Thank you.
Next speaker.
Hi, Chris Durazo. I understand the proposal was the compromise was difficult. I have been there. I understand that, but I do believe this is a slippery slope. I think we should talk in more common sense language. A lot of times, I don't think reducing inclusionary down to 18% is what the voters intended. I think what they intended was that 75% could go to luxury as long as you gave a quarter to the people to give them housing. I think they meant to say that we wanted more share, a fair share of the city. And I think going up to 82% isn't doing that. I think reducing what we already offered for low-income workers, this is not affordable housing, this is not tax credit incomes. These are low-income workers. Reducing that down to 10% isn't what people asked for either. I think they voted for something different, and I think when you're doing these deals and not explaining that and kind of making it sound like it's something different, it's going against our right to vote and the importance of that. And so I really urge you to kind of take that seriously, because people don't vote. People have died for these votes, you know, and inclusionary isn't the best deal, but it wasn't in a middle income program either. It was just, when we fought for it, we said that we wanted to make sure that all these towers were going to not just be exclusive neighborhoods for the wealthy, and they're completely, that's what we have now. We wanted inclusionary to be to say that we want different incomes in there, from the lowest to the highest, and we wanted to have mixed neighborhoods within these buildings if that's the way San Francisco is going to grow. And to kind of like also quantify that into numbers and percentages and profits without looking at the need, without actually addressing the need.
Thank you. Next speaker.
Buenas tardes, mi nombre es María Navarrete.
Good afternoon, my name is Maria Navarrete.
Fui desalojada del distrito de Excelsior y tengo 4 años buscando vivienda.
I was displaced from the Excelsior district and I've been looking for housing for 4 years now.
He aplicado en las loterías de bajos recursos, pero somos muchas personas que no tenemos vivienda.
I've been applying for the lotteries, but it is a lot of people, or a lot of us, who don't have any housing.
Soy madre soltera y vengo representando a las mamás solteras y tengo 2 niñas.
I am a single mother and I'm representing all single mothers. I have 2 daughters.
Y no me parece justo que recorten el porcentaje para las personas de bajos recursos.
I don't think it's fair that the percentage for low income, people from low income households is being cut.
Yo trabajo aquí en San Francisco y mis hijas estudian aquí en el distrito de San Francisco.
I work in San Francisco and my daughters go to school at SF Unified.
Y también han sido afectadas psicológicamente y emocionalmente por no tener un lugar estable.
They have been affected both emotionally and psychologically for not having a stable place to sleep.
Con ese porcentaje que ustedes quieren recortar, nos beneficiamos muchas personas.
For that small percentage that you want to cut, a lot of us could benefit.
Tanto como familias de bajos recursos y personas de tercera edad, y también como estudiantes.
Also, it could be families, seniors, and students could benefit.
Yo les pido, por favor, que no recorten ese porcentaje y hagan más viviendas públicas para familias de bajos recursos. Gracias.
I ask you to please do not cut the percentage for low-income households and help all of us who need housing.
Thank you.
Next speaker, please.
Hi, my name is Phoebe Haynes. I've been in the city of San Francisco all my life, and I probably moved out to another county, but I came back to stay with my grandmother that's been here like 40-some years in low income. We always lived in low income housing, and where I come from, it was always low income housing, working to move up to better housing. So I thought in these years when they was doing all this voting and putting all these buildings here, and I thought maybe they would help the people that's low to move into a better lifestyle and try to help the people. But I'm seeing that I've signed up for all of these lotteries and I haven't gotten one of them. I did receive 3 lotteries, but I'd never gotten an apartment. Either it was due to my credit or however, I was denied. 3, I was accepted for the Nema apartments. I was accepted for 333 Natoma, the Shipyard. They told me I wasn't rent bearing. That's why I didn't receive it. And then Candlestick Heights, I'm still inactive with them right now. And it's been some kind of disruption because they are going under new management, but I was there when they first started the lottery there. So it's been moved to SF Hope, and I'm thinking like, you know, when it goes to SF Help, that they're helping the people that's low income so they can get on their feet and do better. So I'm one of the San Francisco, I am one of the U.S. citizens that's living in Alice Griffith right now, and they're moving to a different, they're moving up.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you, ma'am. Your time has elapsed. I'm sorry. It's the same amount of time for each people. I'm sorry. Yeah, sorry. Okay. Yeah, actually, we can't. Okay. Thank you very much. Are there any more members of the public that would like to comment on this item? Seeing none, I guess public comment is closed.
Supervisor Peskin.
Thank you, Chair Farrell, and thank you to the members of the public who came out to testify today. And while I realize that Home SF is not before us and don't want to make the city attorney nervous about speaking about something that is not on the agenda, insofar as the two pieces of legislation as well as the recommendations that the Planning Commission made are before us, and they are linked. I wanted to point out something that is in the piece of legislation that we will amend and everybody will get to see, and that is that in Home SF, what people have testified to as being objectionable is, or at least part of it, is this comes under the 30 rental housing for not less than 30 years. That, just so everybody is clear, it is my understanding that Home SF references section 415.6 of the Planning Code, and what is before us and will be available for all of the public to see for the next 2 weeks before this is taken up again is a provision in 415.2 of the inclusionary legislation that specifically defines rental housing project as units that shall be rental housing for not less than 30 years. So I just wanted to let everybody know that your people's concerns about Home SF, notwithstanding that particular issue, is addressed. I also want to say that relative to the inclusionary legislation, I appreciate that Supervisors Safai and Breed are in agreement that we will make these amendments today with a little bit of brush up from the city attorney, and we will continue them for 2 weeks. So everybody will have a chance to be able to look at all of the fine-grained detail as it relates to inclusionary. So after we hear from other members of the committee, I would like to adopt these amendments, direct the city attorney to fine-tune them in the next 24 hours, and then continue the item to the next regularly scheduled meeting of the Land Use Committee on June the 5th.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang.
Thank you, Supervisor Peskin, for clarifying that portion. And I certainly heard from a lot of public commenters wonderful talking points that were provided by certain individuals about how there's been a subversion of inclusionary housing ordinance by another ordinance that I have been working on for over 2 years. And I just want to say that I think that there's been confusion around how the percentages of the BMR units have been calculated, and I hope that you'll find the time to understand truly how the calculation works. Secondly, there will be amendments coming at the full board that I think will also address a lot of concerns. But lastly, I just want to say that there's nothing that's been done in secrecy. We are here in Land Use Committee. You can see that there are items that are placed on the agenda. which you can speak about, which you can publicly comment about. And we have talked about inclusionary and other programs that are associated with it since June 13th, 2016, March 13, 2017, May 8th, 2017, May 16th, 2017. So this is in addition to a lot of community outreach as well. So to say that the inclusionary housing agreement that's been reached is being undermined by other programs, I think is a false statement. And so I want to thank the people who came out and provided those talking points for everyone. But again, please understand how our programs really interact with each other. I'm happy to provide information about that if people ask. So that's all I wanted to say, and just want to thank all of my colleagues for working really hard to wrap up your inclusionary conversations.
Thank you, Supervisor Tang. If no other questions or comments, colleagues, do I have a motion then on these items? And I'll just note that Supervisor Safai is temporarily assigned to this committee on my behalf.
Yes. So moved.
You got to make a motion.
Oh, make a motion to accept all the amendments as proposed. Oh, so second. That's what I had said, second.
And for clarity, these are amendments to the 6th item that was called in today's agenda. That is file number 161351.
That is correct.
That is
and
correct.
It will read in alphabetical order. And I'm pleased to say
by last name.
This was not the most difficult part of this negotiation. In alphabetical order by last name, Breed, Kim, Peskin, Safai, Tang.
Yes, that is correct.
And we will, and I'd like to make a motion to table item number 5.
Table item number 5.
Second.
And I guess given that Chair Farrell is only here in body and is not a member of the committee, we will take that without objection and continue this item for 2 weeks. And to members of the public, tomorrow afternoon, you'll be able to see all of these amendments online. And we will hear this again as amended on June the 5th, 2017. And with that, we are adjourned.